She stood in the center of the grand ballroom, alone, still wearing her wedding gown. The silk weighed against her skin like a shroud. Every candle in the chandelier above flickered as if mocking her, and the long train of ivory fabric pooled around her feet, untouched. The ceremony had ended 3 hours earlier. Her husband had not looked at her once during the carriage ride to Blackwood Hall. He had escorted her inside, led her to this cold, glittering room, and then he had simply walked away. No words, no touch, no promise. Servants had passed through the corridor beyond, whispering behind gloved hands. She heard the faint words duty, marriage, fall in house. She trapped him before the heavy doors clicked shut, sealing her in. Alara did not cry. She stood breathing slowly, pressing her folded hands against the ache beneath her ribs. She had known the Duke of Blackwood did not love her. She had not expected cruelty dressed as silence. That silence became the first true wound of her marriage. Alexander Blackwood did not return that night. Alara removed her gown alone, struggling with the tiny pearl buttons her lady's maid had once helped fasten. She slept in a strange bed in a strange room that smelled of lavender and dust, and she stared at the ceiling until dawn broke pale and gray through the curtains. Every minute of that endless night, she replayed her father's desperate voice 2 months earlier, begging her to accept the Duke's sudden proposal. "Our debts will vanish. Your sister can have a future. Alara, please." So she had said yes. She had walked into the cold, magnificent estate of a man who looked at her as if she were a stain on his floor. The following morning she learned the rules without being told. The Duke took breakfast in his study. She ate alone in a small morning room that felt like a forgotten closet. The housekeeper, Mrs. Thorne, informed her that the Duchess was not to enter the East Wing, the Duke's private library, or the music room. "His Grace values silence, Your Grace," the woman said flatly. "Your Grace." The title landed like a bitter joke. Alara nodded. She had been raised with grace, taught to fold pain into small, hidden boxes. She gave no sign of distress. She simply asked for a walk in the gardens. The gardens, at least, were beautiful, wild roses climbing ancient stone walls, a fountain that whispered rather than roared. She sat on a bench beneath a willow and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to mourn the girl she had been. Then she stood, smoothed her dove-gray morning dress, and resolved to survive. For weeks the pattern held. Alexander appeared at formal dinners, seated at the opposite end of a table long enough to seat 30 guests. He spoke only of household accounts, weather, and the briefest acknowledgments of her presence. His voice, deep and measured, never warmed. His eyes, a fierce winter gray, never rested on her face for more than a heartbeat. Alara answered politely. She poured his tea when they met by accident in the drawing room. She asked nothing of him. She kept her sorrow locked in her throat. The loneliness was a physical thing. She wandered the halls, learning every painting, every shadowy corner. One afternoon she discovered a forgotten gallery on the 3rd floor, dusty and neglected. At its far end stood a pianoforte draped in a faded sheet. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the cloth. The instrument was old, a little out of tune, but its keys were whole. Alara had not played since the terrible months when her family's fortune collapsed, when her father's shame drove them from society. Music had been her deepest language. She pressed one key, the note small and hesitant. Then she fled, afraid someone might hear. A duchess who played old, dusty pianos in secret would only invite more ridicule. But the discovery planted a tiny seed of hope inside her chest, a seed she would water in the dark. Weeks later, the first emotional blow came not from Alexander, but from his world. A small dinner party was arranged at Blackwood Hall for a visiting earl and his wife. Alara prepared carefully, wearing a deep blue gown that matched her eyes, hopping to do her duty to not embarrass him. She entered the drawing room and immediately felt the stairs slide over her like cold silk. The earl's wife, Lady Cecily, looked her up and down with a faint, pitying smile. "So this is the new Duchess of Blackwood." "I had heard, of course. How brave you are, my dear, to face society so soon after your family's troubles." The words were dipped in honey but laced with venom. Several guests tittered behind fans. Alara's cheeks burned. She saw Alexander standing near the fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand. He did not intervene. He did not even glance her way. He simply took a slow sip, his profile unyielding as marble. The silence stretched until Alara forced her lips into a calm smile. "Thank you for your concern, Lady Cecily. I find Blackwood Hall to be a great comfort." The lie tasted like ash. That evening, after the guests departed, Alexander paused at the foot of the grand staircase. She was descending slowly, exhausted. For one fleeting moment his gray eyes met hers and she thought she saw something, a flicker of what might have been regret. Then it vanished. "You conducted yourself adequately," he said, his tone offering no warmth. He turned and walked away before she could draw breath to reply. Adequately. She gripped the banister until her knuckles whitened. She had not cried in public, she had not defended herself. She had performed the role of a silent, obedient duchess, and that was all he had to offer. A single, clinical word. That night, the hope she had nurtured in the hidden gallery began to wither. She did not go back to the pianoforte for days. Change arrived without announcement. A month later, a new neighbor was introduced to the district. Mr. Julian Ashford, a composer and pianist of modest renown, had inherited a small estate 3 miles from Blackwood. Alara learned of his arrival when Mrs. Thorne mentioned he would call to pay respects. The name meant nothing to her at first, but when the man walked into the drawing room, her heart stopped. Julian Ashford was the same kind-eyed boy who had taught her to play piano when she was 12, the son of her family's former music master. He had disappeared from her life when her father's scandals broke, and she had assumed he, like everyone else, had abandoned them. He was taller now, his hair darker, his face leaner, but his smile was exactly the same, warm, unguarded, and full of quiet recognition. He bowed over her hand, and his voice carried a tremor of old affection. "Your Grace. It has been a long time." Alexander stood near the window, rigid. He watched the reunion with a gaze that sharpened like a blade. He did not know Julian. He did not know the history. But he saw the way the composer looked at his wife, the way she blushed slightly, the way her breath caught. Something cold and possessive flickered behind his carefully schooled expression. Julian asked permission to call again to discuss the possibility of hosting a musical evening for the local parish. Alara could not refuse. Alexander granted permission with a curt nod, but his jaw was tight. That evening he lingered in the corridor as she returned to her chambers. "You seem unusually acquainted with Mr. Ashford," he said, his voice deceptively calm. Alara turned, surprised. "He was my teacher once, long ago, a childhood friend." The Duke's eyes grew remote. "I see. Be careful how you nurture childhood friendships, Your Grace. Appearances matter." He left her standing in the dark hallway, confused and stung. It was the first time he had shown anything resembling possessiveness. It felt like an accusation, not a shield. Julian's visits continued. He was invited to a small musical soiree at a neighboring estate, and Alara, as Duchess, was expected to attend. Alexander accompanied her, a silent, intimidating shadow at her side. The evening was pleasant until Lady Cecily, ever venomous, leaned close to Alara during an interval. "Everyone notices how Mr. Ashford looks at you. One might almost think you welcome the attention, given how little your husband provides." She laughed, light and cruel, before gliding away. Alara's fingers went cold. She looked across the room and saw Alexander watching her, his expression unreadable but his stillness dangerous. He had heard something. He had seen the lingering glance Julian cast her way. He had felt the rip in his own composure. That night in the carriage home, the silence was suffocating. Finally, Alexander spoke, each word precise and cutting. "You will limit your interactions with Mr. Ashford. I will not have my Duchess become the subject of petty gossip." Alara stared at her gloved hands. "He is the only person in this county who has shown me any kindness. You cannot ask me to abandon that." The Duke's voice dropped, roughened. "I am not asking." The words were a door slamming shut. She said nothing more. The distance between them on the velvet seat felt wider than any ocean. But deep in her chest, something began to shift. She had tried so hard to reach a man who kept building walls. Perhaps it was time to stop trying. The next morning, Alara did not appear at breakfast. She left the estate early, walking alone to the village. She had learned of a small orphanage on the edge of the parish, a place of drafty windows and too few blankets. The matron, a tired but gentle woman named Mrs. Crew, welcomed her uncertainly. Alara offered something simple, music lessons. She would come 3 times a week to teach the children singing, and if a pianoforte could be found, perhaps more. She had no money of her own, but she had her knowledge. She had her time, and she was done filling her days waiting for a man who would not look at her. The orphanage became her sanctuary. She found an old spinet in the village church that the vicar allowed her to use. She taught the children simple songs, watched their faces light up with melody, and felt a purpose she had not felt since her wedding day. She stopped listening for Alexander's footsteps in the hall. She stopped hoping he would knock on her door. She gave her smiles to the children, her laughter to the matron, and she brought back to Blackwood Hall only silence. Alexander noticed the change immediately. At first he was relieved. Her absence meant fewer uncomfortable dinners, fewer moments when her sad blue eyes accused him of failures he was not ready to name. But within a week, the silence of the house began to grate on him. He found himself pausing outside her empty morning room. He asked Mrs. Thorne where her grace spent her afternoons, and the answer, teaching orphans at the parish, snagged in his chest like a thorn. The Duchess was helping the poor while he sat in his study brooding over ledgers and old wounds. He had married her to settle a debt, to right a hidden wrong, but somewhere along the way he had become the villain. The realization crept in, unwelcome and slow. Then came the day of the autumn market fair. The entire district gathered in the village square. Alara attended with the orphan children, helping them sell small crafts and sweetmeats to raise funds. She wore a simple sprigged muslin dress, her hair pulled back with a blue ribbon, and she was laughing, actually laughing, as a little boy tugged her hand toward the gingerbread stall. Julian Ashford was there too, helping the children sing a round. He stood close to Alara, his head bent toward hers, and their easy intimacy was a knife twisting in Alexander's gut as he watched from across the square. He had come only because the parish expected the Duke's presence. He had not expected to see his wife glowing with a joy he had never given her, standing beside a man who clearly adored her. Jealousy rose, hot and unfamiliar, and he crushed his riding gloves in his fist. Lady Cecily's voice slithered from behind him. How touching! The Duchess seems to have found her true place and her true companion. Alexander turned sharply, his eyes blazing. "Mind your tongue, madam." The lady recoiled, curtsied hastily, and fled, but the damage was done. The Duke stood frozen, watching his wife laugh with another man, and he felt something break open inside him. Not anger alone, fear. He was losing something he had never truly possessed. That night he waited for Alara in the grand hall. She returned flushed and happy, a basket of leftover fair trinkets on her arm. She stopped when she saw him, the happiness dimming into guarded wariness. "Your Grace, is something wrong?" He stepped closer. His voice was hoarse. "You were with Ashford all day." She lifted her chin. "I was with the children." Mr. Ashford assisted with the music as any parishioner might. The distance in her tone was new. It was polite. It was empty. And it terrified him. "I do not want you near him," Alexander said, but the command came out cracked, desperate. Alara studied him, her eyes tired. "You made that clear. I am not near him. He is simply there where kindness exists. You would not recognize it." She curtsied, coldly correct, and walked past him up the stairs. Alexander stood rooted, the echo of her words stripping away his pride. The next day he sought answers. He had wed Alara Voss for a reason that rotted in his conscience. Her father, Harold Voss, had been a merchant who partnered with the late Duke of Blackwood, Alexander's father, in an investment venture. Harold Voss had mismanaged funds, covered losses with forged papers, and fled, leaving Alexander's father financially ruined and publicly shamed. The old Duke's health had collapsed under the disgrace. He died within the year, bitter and broken. Alexander inherited a hollow title and a burning need for vengeance. When he finally traced Harold Voss, the man was dying. His family destitute, his younger daughter frail. The only asset the family had was Alara's marriage value. Alexander offered a deal, Alara's hand in exchange for paying all debts and providing a small stipend for the sister's care. He had believed, with the fury of grief, that Alara must have known of her father's crimes. He had married her intending to shame her, to let her feel the cold weight of a family name ruined. But something had shifted. Now he dug into the old papers again, pulling out letters and ledgers. Among them, he found a thin, tear-stained letter from Harold Voss written the week before the wedding, addressed to Alexander but apparently never sent. It had been tucked inside a legal folio. Alexander broke the seal with unsteady hands. "Your Grace, I go to my grave with this truth. My daughter Alara knew nothing of my deception. I hid all from her to protect her and her sister. She accepted your proposal believing she was saving her family honorably, not knowing the shame I brought upon yours. She is innocent. If you have any pity, spare her the hatred I deserve. Let her believe you married her for duty alone, not punishment. Forgive an old fool's last request." The paper shook in Alexander's grip. He read it 3 times. Alara was not complicit, she never had been. She had walked into this marriage carrying only love for her sister and a desperate hope for survival, while he had drenched her in silence and scorn. The guilt landed like a physical blow, robbing him of breath. He had punished an innocent woman for his father's ruin. He had let her suffer the whispers, the isolation, the cold of his own making. He pressed his fist to his forehead, and a sound escaped him, half groan, half sob. He had to make it right. He had to reach her before she slipped away forever. He went to her rooms that evening, but her maid said her Grace was not yet returned from the orphanage. Alexander rode out himself, the autumn wind biting. At the small stone building, he heard music spilling through a cracked window. He stopped. It was the spinet, the one in the parish hall where the children practiced. But the playing was not a child. It was intricate, heartbreaking, a nocturne full of longing and loss. He moved closer unseen and looked through the dusty glass. Alara sat at the old instrument, her fingers dancing over yellowed keys, her face transformed. Gone was the subdued, careful duchess. She played as if the music were her only voice, pouring every unspoken sorrow into the melody. Tears slid down her cheeks, but her expression was one of aching release. Alexander stood transfixed, his heart pounding. He had never known. She had hidden this gift, this soul, because he had made her feel unwelcome in her own home. He turned away and leaned against the cold stone wall, listening until the last note faded, feeling the weight of his mistakes settle into his bones. The next afternoon he went to find Julian Ashford. He found the composer in his modest cottage garden, writing sheets of music. Julian rose warily. Alexander did not waste time. "You care for the Duchess?" Julian's jaw tightened. "I have known her since she was a girl. I care for her happiness, something you, your Grace, have done little to provide." Alexander absorbed the blow without flinching. "I know. I am here to ask you to step back, not because I command it as a duke, but because I intend to fight for my wife. I have wronged her deeply. I want to make amends. If she chooses you after she knows the whole truth, I will not stand in your way. But I need a chance." Julian stared at him for a long moment. Then he gave a slow, sad smile. "She never loved me the way you fear. She loves you, I think, though it has nearly destroyed her. I will not interfere, but I will not disappear. She needs friends, not jailers." He extended his hand. Alexander took it, the grip firm with shared understanding. It was the most humbling moment of the Duke's life. That evening, Alexander sent a note to Alara, asking her to meet him in the music room, the forbidden music room of Blackwood Hall. He had unlocked it, aired it, and lit candles that flickered over the grand pianoforte his mother had once played. He waited, terrified. When Alara entered, she stopped at the threshold, her eyes wide. She had never been allowed here. Her gaze moved from the gleaming instrument to his face. "What is this?" she whispered. Alexander's voice was rough, raw. "This was my mother's music room. I closed it after she died. I could not bear to hear anyone play. And when you came, I kept it closed out of spite because I believed you were part of my father's ruin. Tonight I am opening it for you and for the truth." He told her everything. The debt, the forged papers, her father's guilt, his own vengeful heart. He told her about the hidden letter proving her innocence. He confessed that he had married her to punish her, and instead he had slowly, agonizingly fallen in love with the woman he was destroying. His voice cracked. "I loved you too late. I see now that every silence was a cruelty. I see the way you look at Ashford, and I know I drove you there. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am asking for a single chance to show you the man I should have been from the start." Lara stood motionless, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles shone white. Tears streamed freely, but she did not look away. When she spoke, her voice was a broken whisper. "All these months I thought you despised me for my father's shame. I thought I was nothing but a transaction. I played piano in a dusty gallery because I was afraid you would take even that away if you heard. I gave up hopping for your kindness. I gave up hopping for you." She pressed a hand to her chest. "And now you tell me you love me. After you let them humiliate me. After you watched me drown and said nothing." Alexander dropped to his knees. The Duke of Blackwood on his knees on the cold floor of his mother's music room before his wife. I know, I'm ashamed. I will spend the rest of my life making it right if you let me. I will listen to every piece you play. I will never again let silence be my answer." His gray eyes, always so wintry, glistened with unshed tears. "Please, Alara, please don't leave me in the quiet." The room held its breath. Then Alara moved. She walked slowly to the pianoforte and sat down. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play, not the piece of sorrow from the parish, but something new, something that started with hesitant notes of pain and gradually swelled into a melody of tentative, fragile hope. Alexander remained on his knees, listening, tears finally escaping down his carved features. He understood. She was not ready to give him words, but she was giving him her music. It was a beginning. In the weeks that followed, the house changed. Alexander had the pianoforte moved into a sunlit sitting room where Alara could play any time. He attended her orphanage lessons, sitting quietly in the back, watching the children adore her. He publicly rebuked Lady Cecily's gossip at a county assembly, declaring his duchess the finest woman of his acquaintance. He wrote to Alara's sister, ensuring her care was lavishly provided. And slowly, piece by piece, Alara let the walls fall. They took walks in the gardens, and he learned to speak of small things, his love of old books, his fear of thunderstorms as a boy, the grief he had never processed. She shared memories of her mother, her lost music, her long nights of loneliness. The distance between them shrank, not all at once, but day by painful, beautiful day. One evening they sat together in the music room. She had just finished a duet she had composed, and he had turned pages for her with clumsy devotion. She looked at him, her eyes soft. "You never told me why you finally opened this room." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. "Because I wanted to hear your voice, not the one you use for guests, but the real one. And I realized that the only way to hear it was to stop talking myself and listen." He pressed her fingers to his lips. "I am listening, Alara. I will always listen." She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. The last notes of the duet seemed to hover in the candlelight. "Then hear this," she said quietly. "I have loved you since the day you handed me into the carriage after our wedding, because even then I saw a man carrying too much pain. I just didn't know how to reach you. Now I think we can reach each other." He wrapped his arms around her, a shuddering breath leaving him. The silence between them was no longer a wound. It was a shared peace. Spring came to Blackwood Hall with a cascade of roses and new leaves. The Duke and Duchess hosted a concert to raise funds for the orphanage, with Alara herself performing a piece she had written during their reconciliation, titled The Returning Light. Julian Ashford conducted the small orchestra, and his smile as he bowed to the Duchess was one of genuine, uncomplicated friendship. The county came to listen. And when the final chord echoed through the great hall, Alexander stood, walked to the pianoforte, and kissed his wife's hand before the entire assembly. There were no whispers now, only applause. That night they stood together on the balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens. Alara leaned against the stone railing, and Alexander wrapped his coat around her shoulders. "I nearly lost you," he said, his voice thick. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with the star's reflection. "But you didn't. You fought. You changed. That is all any heart can ask." He bent his head and kissed her forehead with a tenderness that held all the words they no longer needed. The wind carried the scent of roses, and somewhere inside the house, a servant hummed the melody of the returning light. Ilara smiled, and it was a smile full of hope, finally unshadowed. They stayed there until the sky shifted toward dawn, wrapped in a silence that healed everything that had been broken. The Duke's unforgivable silence had become the rarest music of all, the quiet that comes after forgiveness, deep and certain, promising never to fade. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. Your support means a lot to us. Thank you for watching and see you in the next amazing story.